Hi, I'm Conrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. In this episode, we talk to Mark Manson, author of the international bestseller, The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F. Manson, who's also a prolific speaker and blogger, discusses how the mantra of relentless positivity, which drives so much of the self-help industry, is full of pitfalls. He explains how negative emotions have a purpose to drive us to do something, and why the willingness to look like an idiot occasionally guards against self-entitlement. And hosting this conversation about everything from why so much self-help advice gets it wrong to dealing with cyber stalkers is Good Weekend Deputy Editor Greg Callaghan.
Thank you, Conrad, and welcome, Mark.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, your best-selling book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F, was the #1 non-fiction book on Amazon in 2017. Gratifyingly, I might say, ahead of J.D. Vance's memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, which was #2. Why do you think your book struck such a chord?
I think it was the first self-help book to speak to the realities of living in the social media age, of just being bombarded by so much information, so much noise, so much craziness in the world, and the struggle that one goes through in trying to sift through all of that stimulation and also prioritize what's actually worth paying attention to and caring about and what's not.
Yeah, pretty much the entire self-help industry is built around urging us to remain positive all the time. We're told that a positive attitude is a fundamental prerequisite for financial and emotional success. Being relentlessly positive is not just exhausting in my view, but it's kind of in defiance of day-to-day reality. And that's something that sort of resonates in your book, isn't it? Your books, I should say.
Yeah, I personally think that positive thinking is a little bit overrated. You know, I do think it is good to have a bias towards action and a belief in oneself, like a general optimism about life, but I think ultimately it's better to think realistic, which is that realistically a certain percentage of everybody's life is going to be really challenging and is going to kind of suck. So I just think we need to be honest about that and not necessarily see that as a bad thing. Like it's, if you're going through a hard time, that's not a failure or anything to be ashamed of. It's just part of life. It's just something that we all go through.
And you say in your books that negativity or being realistic at times, in effect, can lead to positivity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't learn from your mistakes or adjust to your failures if you're not willing to recognize what's gone wrong in your life. I mean, it's like things hurt for a reason. You're not supposed to do them anymore. So if you just like pretend like nothing hurts, you're not going to learn the lesson.
The mantra of positivity seems so embedded in the American dream, though, doesn't it? You work hard enough, you never give up, you always remain positive, and finally you'll succeed. It worked for people like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnie had sort of a mantra of positivity from the very start, from the day he put his foot on American soil. But there are obviously for most of us, there are a lot of other factors come into play, not the least luck, I would add.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think the United States developed a culture around positivity, kind of a delusional positivity, just because it was, geographically, historically, economically, it was a place of kind of infinite economic opportunity for people who came here, and that was true for much of its history. So to me, it makes sense that you develop a culture around, like, if you want something, you just go get it, go and do it. And I think there's a lot of great things to that attitude, but it's important to, again, be realistic and understand that there are other factors that come into play, that life is complicated, that not everything goes the way you expect or intend it to. and then being willing to learn and adjust as necessary.
Yeah, one of the insightful things you point out in the book that resonated with me in particular is that people are more afraid of public humiliation than they are of death. And perhaps this is oversharing, but about 15 years ago, I went through a lot of stress at work, and I had a recurring nightmare of standing naked in the lobby of this workplace. And it spoke to me, when I think about it, of my extreme stress at that time. But it does relate to exactly what you've written about. And that is, this is our biggest fear, isn't it? This sort of shame, this public humiliation, being embarrassed, making a fool of ourselves.
Yeah, I think many people are controlled by that fear. It dictates their life to them.
So why do we care so much about what other people think of us?
Well, if you want kind of the boring scientific reason, evolutionarily speaking, most of humanity's history was lived in small tribes and small groups. And so if you humiliated yourself in front of the tribe and you were rejected from the tribe, that was basically the same thing as death. If you didn't have the tribe to help support you, you wouldn't last long in the caveman days. So I think we evolutionarily adopted this intense fear and phobia of the disapproval of others and not fitting in and not being liked by the people around us. But like many things, there's kind of a mismatch. There's like an evolutionary mismatch between kind of like our hardwired psychology and what's actually very adaptive in the modern world. Like we live in a modern world now where, if you humiliate yourself, it's not the end of the world. Your life is going to go on. You probably learn from the experience. You can maybe, get a different job, go work in a different building and, take things from there.
And that's exactly what I did, Mark.
Yeah.
You also say that the willingness to, look like an idiot and embarrass yourself is the bedrock of not giving a F. And I think of that video where you dressed up as a chicken in public.
I sure didn't care. But the problem is, the idea by itself is not sufficient. You have to get out into the world and experience it. You have to get out and challenge your own spotlight effect. Now, does that mean you have to put on a chicken suit, walk down the Venice boardwalk? No, of course not. But it does mean you have to do something. You have to challenge yourself. You have to put yourself in the public and into uncomfortable situations and prove to yourself conclusively.
I mean, that takes cojones, mate, I've got to say. So
not just dressed like a chicken, but jumped out of a plane dressed as a chicken.
That's right. Yes,
I wanted to prove that chickens can fly. That was the plan all along. No, it's fun. One of the things, it's really fun. I'm at a point in my career now where, I feel very compelled to kind of just give back to my fans and my audience. And one of the things that's been really inspiring the past couple of years is finding fans who are struggling with some sort of issue or who give way too many Fs and actually fly out and meet them and kind of force them to do ridiculous and zany things to overcome those fears. And so we did a YouTube video last year. We had a guy who was just way caught up in his own head, always worrying about what other people think. And we had him do a bunch of embarrassing things in public to help him get over his anxieties and over his fears. But, like as any good teacher or coach, you don't want to force somebody to do something that you're not willing to do yourself. So ultimately, I put on the chicken suit and jumped out of the plane as well.
And you don't appear to have any fear of heights. Quite the contrary, in fact. You seem to enjoy being in a kind of vertigo nightmare, if you like.
Yeah, there's a scene in the book where I stand at the edge of a cliff. I think at some point in my early life, I became addicted to confronting fear. And, initially I confronted fears just out of personal development and trying to free myself from the prison of my own fears. But I think as I did it more, I became a little bit hooked on it. And so I've actually strangely become a bit of a thrill seeker the older I've gotten, and I get like a rush from it. I don't know. It's like an adrenaline thing.
Isn't that fantastic? Now, another theme in your book that, in The Subtle Art, that is, that really resonated with me too, is this sense of entitlement. And it seems to me that we're living in the age of entitlement now. I suspect it's being fueled by social media, which you've already pointed out yourself, via algorithms that make you feel special, that you're the center of attention, that life is only full of the possibility of positive experiences. Has social media fed into this age of entitlement, in your view?
Yes, but I wouldn't stop at social media. I would say it's mass media in general. I would say it's to a certain extent technology in general. I would say it's kind of a world of convenience. Like everything has been optimized to make things as convenient as possible and people as comfortable as possible. And don't get me wrong, I think convenience and comfort is good. Like I don't think people should suffer unnecessarily, but I think what we're discovering as a society is that there's a certain amount of friction in life that's optimal. Like you probably shouldn't be able to hear and see everything you already believe reflected back to you. You shouldn't necessarily be able to get everything you want from a click of a button on your phone whenever you want it. There's a certain, like you lose, there's a friction in life that actually forces you to invest in things and care about things and find meaning in things. And I think a lot of what we're struggling with as a society in terms of loneliness, public health issues, mental health issues, entitlement, it kind of comes back to this society of constant convenience and pleasure. So I try to intentionally inject a little bit of friction into my own life, and I encourage others to do the same.
Yes, you actually say in one of your videos and also in The Subtle Art that the willingness to make sacrifices is a pretty good guard against entitlement.
Totally.
What sort of sacrifices, what do you think, say, for argument's sake, doing volunteering or being present for friends and not just family is part of that process of guarding against entitlement?
I think yes, and I think this is the sort of thing it exists on many dimensions, right? So it's getting involved in the community, making time for friends and loved ones, making simple sacrifices in your own life for the sake of your own health, giving up alcohol, giving up sugar, not staying out till 4 or 5 in the morning on a Tuesday night. Like these are all simple things of simple practices of self-discipline or simple self-denial that, like, ultimately it's a form of investment, of building something important and meaningful in the long run. And I worry that as everything in our lives, from media to retail to remote work and our jobs at home and everything, the more everything just kind of revolves around instant gratification, the more we lose those muscles, those sacrifice muscles, the self-denial muscles that add a sense of depth and profundity to life.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I did a small piece earlier this year about sort of what I called the kind of the phone drones at the gym where I go to. The people who seem to spend half their workout on their phones scrolling through social media. And it not only means that they're hogging equipment at the gym, but it means that why they're getting up at 5 o'clock or 5:30 in the morning if they're just going to scroll through social media at the gym. And it is, you have so nailed this very problem in society that it's not distraction, it's about this gratification issue. And even when we're trying to look after ourselves, exercise. Even that's been contaminated now.
It's so omnipresent, it's hard to get away from it. And I I really think, I wrote a piece a number of years ago. I called it the attention diet. And I think a really useful analogy or metaphor for this is, probably 50, 60 years ago, we reached a point of food abundance, and we could manufacture through industrial processes more food than everybody needed. And so suddenly we had this great abundance of, you go to the supermarket and there's 28 different types of potato chips, and you can get 15 different types of frozen pizzas, and there's 8 different brands of milk. And, so it's just this abundance. And it's around that same time that we start to see the physical health crisis begin, obesity epidemic and heart disease and diabetes and all these things that have been happening. And I think it took a couple decades, but as a culture, we adjusted and learned that, like, hey, you can't just go eat whatever you want. It's in a world of food abundance, you have to be very conscientious and careful about what choices you're making, and really check your own impulses and not give in to just like your first choice all the time, to instant gratification every time. I think the same thing is happening with information. It's the same way you have to occasionally go on a food diet to keep your physical health in order. I think we have to go on information diets to keep our mental health in order, to check our own personal impulses and not give in to instant gratification all the time.
It's interesting you talk about the food abundance and how that emerged, because you battled with being overweight yourself in your teens and right through your 20s. And then in your mid-30s, you found yourself borderline obese. So you're a bit of a poster boy for makeovers yourself, because here you are, nice and slim and very fit looking.
Yeah.
So how have you done it over the past few years? How have you turned yourself from this overweight person who was pre-diabetic, I think you've said? How did you turn yourself into this lean fighting machine that you are now?
Well, it was a long process, and I'll just give a quick little history. I think I I exist in the self-help industry. And of course, every person in self-help, you're supposed to be, get up at 4 a.m. and go do deadlifts at the gym and go run 8 miles and drink a green smoothie and all this stuff. I never did that. And I kind of wore it as a badge of honor. It's like, while the other guy's getting up at 4 a.m., I'm coming back from the party and I'm probably hungover. And, so for a long time, I took a little bit of pride in that, but it caught up with me. And by the age of 35, I started running into like some pretty significant health problems. And there's some health issues that run in my family. And so it was a little bit of a wake up call of like, I've got to get this together. But it's been a long process. And what I have learned is that it's not about the, signing up for the latest program or downloading the right fitness app or finding the perfect workout in a fitness magazine or whatever. It's like really boring, basic lifestyle changes. And there's a whole psychological process that comes along with it, which is just simply learning to not lie to yourself. And I think to tie this back into the instant gratification thing and the managing your own impulses thing, I think when it comes to our impulsive behaviors, be it social media or eating too much ice cream, we are experts at lying to ourselves. We're experts at justifying to ourselves. We're experts at saying to ourselves while we're sitting in the gym, scrolling Instagram for 20 minutes between sets, saying like, oh, I'm not spending that much time. It's just a few minutes. Whereas like, no, you're actually spending like half your time in the gym on the stupid phone, right? So there's like an honest conversation that needs to happen with yourself. And this comes back into to tie it even to the positive thinking thing. You can't delude yourself with positive thinking. You have to be real, and you have to be like, this is a problem. I have a problem. I'm not trustworthy with this device. I'm not trustworthy with my food choices. Like, I need guardrails. I need to be like treated like a child for a certain amount of time until I develop the correct habits and better behaviors that I can, you can take the training wheels off. So for me, it was a very long process. There were a bunch of, it was an up and down thing, but over the course of, it's been about 5 years, and I've lost probably about 25 kilos in that time,
Gosh.
and kept it off. And I feel great. It's been great, but being honest, it's one of the hardest things I've ever done.
Yeah, being honest is difficult, isn't it? Because we constantly lie to ourselves, and we're quite delusional as creatures. It's like a friend of mine who's quite overweight and regularly recites the tired old joke, it's not the chocolate muffins, it's my allergy that's making me fat. That kind of,
yeah, right.
That's sort of that kind of denial. It's part of our lives as human beings. Now, I've got to talk about your writing style, because as a journalist, a print journalist, I'm always observant of these things, and you've got this what's been described as a pretty frank and with a dash of humour, man-to-man chat style of writing. And you produced a video which was called Brutally Honest Advice for Young Men. And your first book, in fact, was Models Attract Women Through Honesty. Now, I haven't read that book, but there's so much about young men that's being written at the moment, and anybody with a son in this age bracket, it's an important subject. But we're all worried about the kind of messages that Andrew Tate and his brother have been sending to young men. What's your take on them?
Well, just all around disgusted and horrified. Like, I started my career specifically writing for I started my career as a young man writing for other young men. And as I've gotten older, my audience has branched out into kind of a wider mainstream audience. But in the last couple of years, I've noticed that there seems to be a lot of Gen Z young men who are feeling lost, unheard, left behind, directionless, whatever it may be. And so I've been trying to return to some of those messages again, this time as an older man. And because I just, to me, the whole Tate phenomenon, the thing that I take from it, like, there's always going to be scummy men out there who are trying to sell you something or trying to grift on you or whatever. The fact that he became so popular so fast, to me, the message is that there's a vacuum right now of public male role models, and it's not being filled. And so, because it's not being filled with any sort of healthy role model, it's being filled by an unhealthy role model. And so, I think it is incumbent, particularly on the men in my industry, to try to step up and be a healthier alternative to that. And it's a conversation that's been happening in private with a lot of people in my industry, and a lot of us are trying to kind of consciously step up for the exact same reason. And I feel like it is slowly having an effect, like it is getting through. But yeah, Tate was a little bit of a wake-up call, I think. It should be a wake-up call to everybody of like, don't forget about these young boys, these kids, these guys. Like, they need somebody, they need attention, they need somebody to look up to.
Indeed, the subtle art of not giving an F, and your other books should be good reads for young men, I reckon, because they're lessons in moderation, practicing sort of realistic, but also action-driven responses in life. And I wonder if somehow this message of moderation is being lost today. It seems that society is becoming more polarized. not just politically, but also socially. Is that your observation?
For sure. And what's interesting, there have been some recent studies, at least here in the United States, that are finding that the polarization is more and more happening among gender lines as well. So particularly with the younger generation. So that concerns me as well. It's bad enough having two kind of political sides that don't really want to talk or deal with each other. If that starts to become a gender-based thing, then that's a real problem. So I pretty much constantly feel compelled, I guess, as a public figure or a person with an audience, to help people engage with those that maybe they disagree with or that they find distasteful. To not just write it off as, oh, well, those are terrible people. Let's not think about what they just said or why they're saying it or why they have attention. Like, I think it's really important that we all develop a skill within ourselves to be able to engage with those that make us uncomfortable.
Indeed, one of the things that we should clarify is that your books, and starting with The Subtle Art, are not about indifference. They're not about not caring. Quite the opposite. Your message is one of moderation and just common sense, really. Can you clarify that and maybe correct what an assumption might be of somebody just picking up the book or seeing the title and not actually reading it?
Sure. So I often joke that the book is a little bit of a Trojan horse, which is that the title promises that you're not going to give an F about anything. But, once you get about halfway through chapter 1, I point out that there's no such thing as not giving an F about anything. Like there's no such thing as indifference. If you're trying to be indifferent about everything, then that's, by definition, you're caring too much about everything. So the real question is what are you going to choose to give an F about? Because you have to give an F about something. So you might as well be very conscious in directing your time and attention towards the things that you give an F about. And I think, as I mentioned before, in the social media age, that awareness and choice is more important than ever before. And I think, in line with the moderation message, it is, moderation is required in this day and age, just given the abundance of everything that we have and everything that's going on.
It sure is. Now, talking about the social media age, you've been pretty burned by it yourself. You were cyber stalked for a few years, weren't you?
Yeah, that was a thing.
Can you tell us a little about that?
I'll tell you a funny story about it. So there was a woman who, thankfully she was harmless. She was not physically threatening in any way, but she would appear at my events. She would fly around. She would find out where I am and try to fly around and find me and follow me around. And she was mentally unwell, and she told me that in her dreams, God was telling her that she and I were supposed to be together because we were going to save the world. So it was a whole thing. And I tried all these different ways to handle it. And she would create all these profiles and comment on all my stuff. And she started making web pages that looked like mine. And then she would every article I wrote, she would write a response article with the same title, and she was claiming that I was that she was married to me and that we were, she was my ex-girl, all this stuff. And
wow,
it went on for years, and it went on for about 6 or 7 years. And it was funny because I had the chance a number of years ago to meet Sir Richard Branson, and I was at a breakfast at the same table with him, and somehow stalkers came up, and he told a story about his stalker, and then I told the story about my stalker, and then at the end of the story I said, well, people at the table were like, wow, that's really horrible. And I was like, yeah, but she was mentally unwell, like clearly had mental health problems. And Richard Branson looked at me and he was like, well, clearly, I mean, who would stalk you?
Well, that must have brought you down a few notches at the
Oh,
time.
man,
I mean, as you were describing all that, I was, of course, thinking of the obvious, and that is baby reindeer.
yeah. So that show hit close to home. That show really hit close to home.
I bet.
Yeah.
I bet. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but did I read somewhere that you actually introduced your wife to this woman to try and bring her back to reality, or that you're actually with someone, or was that correctly reported?
Yes. So that story is in one of my books. It was funny actually, because it was my wife's idea. So my wife and I, we'd been together for a few years. She had found out about this woman. You know, it was a whole thing. At first, she was kind of like, "This is weird. Why is this woman following this guy?" And then I showed her all the emails and the comments and everything, and she realized, she was like, "Okay." And so I was traveling with her. We weren't married at the time, but she and I were traveling together. And once again, my stalker had flown quite far to show up where I was and try to meet me in person again. And I found out, she emailed me, and I found out she was in the same city as me. And my wife was like, "You know what? Let's go talk to her." And I was like, "Oh, no. And, and she said, she was like, maybe if she meets me and she talks to me and she understands, like she see, like maybe if I explain to her that like you and I are in a very committed relationship and that this is adding stress to our relationship, like maybe she'll understand if I'm the one who tells her." And I was like, "All right, good luck." And so we went to a cafe and met her, and we sit down with her, and my wife very eloquently gives this whole talk about how Mark and I are together and we're in a very committed relationship and we're talking about marriage, and when you're emailing him 8 times a day and calling him all the time, it's like it puts stress in our relationship. And anyway, she gives this like very beautiful, respectful, well-crafted speech to her, and politely asks her to back off and let it go and move on. And my stalker immediately looked at her and she said, "Oh no, I'm so sorry. I think you misunderstand. You don't have to break up with him. We can both be with him together." And my wife looked at me like, "What the hell?" And I was just like, I told you, this was not going to go well."
Wow, what a story.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to wind up the interview on a downer, Mark. It's about death.
Okay.
Because you talk about death reminding ourselves, or the prospect of death, that is, reminding ourselves of what's important in our lives. And yet we basically spend our day-to-day lives in denial of our own mortality, don't we? I think we don't think about it. It's not, we know at some stage it's going to happen, but we don't spend our day-to-day lives thinking about it. So how do we remind ourselves of the really important things of life without sort of becoming depressed that we're, getting to the end of the line, so to speak?
Well, I think thinking about our own mortality is useful as a thought experiment. I don't think it's, I don't encourage people to actually like think about themselves dying constantly. But I do think, Steve Jobs had this famous thing where he said that frequently in the morning, he would look in the mirror and ask himself, if this was my last day alive, would I be happy doing what I'm doing today? And he said that if the answer was no for too many days in a row, then he would like sit down and have a very serious conversation with himself about what he was doing in life. And I think ultimately like that practice, the Stoics called it memento mori. The Buddhists often reinforce it. I just think it's such a useful thing because there's so much going on in our lives that it's very hard to get clarity on what's actually important, what's actually going to matter in the long run, what we actually care about beyond ourselves, and what's actually just ego playing out. And I think when we sit and really imagine, play some of these thought experiments of like, if this was my last day alive, or if I had a year left to live, or what would my 80-year-old self think about what I'm doing today? I think those things are just good for grounding us and orienting ourselves towards the things that actually matter. Generally, you find anybody who's had a serious health scare, anybody who's been in a serious accident or had a brush with death or had somebody very close to them die, pretty much unanimously, they say that it actually gives them a lot of clarity on the things that matter in their lives and the things that don't. So I don't think we should necessarily have to wait for a calamity to happen to ask ourselves those questions.
It's such great advice. The standard question many journalists ask a celebrity or a subject is, what advice would you give to your 7-year-old self or 10-year-old self or 15-year-old self? And it's not only a cliche, it's really tiresome, and probably not very useful. But what is very useful, as per your books, is when you get older, thinking about your 80-year-old self is much more beneficial.
Yeah. Because
it does, as you've just outlined, encourage you to assess your priorities in life and realize that, there's not an infinite amount of time left.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember if it was Shane Parrish or Oliver Berkman, I don't know, some author friend of mine. He has a thing where he says like, ask yourself if what you're doing would make your 8-year-old self and your 80-year-old self smile. And if either of them wouldn't, then you should reevaluate what you're doing.
Excellent. Well, look, we're really looking forward to seeing you in Australia again. Really enjoyed chatting, and thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. Excited to be back down there.
Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Subscriptions power our newsrooms. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Chi Wong. Editing from Conrad Marshall. Tom McKendrick is head of audio. And Katrina Strickland is the editor of Good Weekend.